So in this video, what I want to kind of go over, and with this live stream, I should say, not video, but with this live stream, I'm going to kind of go over an idea that was sparked in my head when I was doing a Reddit session. I was going through Reddit, scrolling through different subreddits, and I just kind of sat there and I thought, one of the problems that businesses are constantly trying to tackle is scaling agile. This idea of scaling, and how do we take this idea of values and principles and practices, which practices come typically from like XP or Scrum, and how do I take those things and spread them across the organization? How do I, as a organization, plan my teams and organize my teams and plan out the efforts that each one of the teams are going to be doing? And I think that becomes a bit of a challenge when the developers have a certain set of values and things that they're trying to do. And then, of course, the businesses are trying to do certain things and get the maximum amount of effort out of their teams. And you can have a lot of cross purposes. So trying to think of what would a good system be like if I was to remain as hardcore agile and extreme programming practices as I could possibly be, maybe throw in a little Scrum. What would that type of organization look like? What would that process, if you will, or plan of action, what would that look like? And I'm just throwing out all sorts of things. I'm not thinking about, there's other systems out there like Less or Safe that already try to tackle what I'm talking about. And even Uncle Bob, I just read out of his book that he just recently released called Clean Agile, that, he basically thinks that it's not even an issue for agile teams. Because management is going to manage. And that's not really something for us. The Agile was really about developer-centric practices and things, not organization practices. Agile was never for the organization, it was for developers, which totally makes sense. But I think that teams have to try to figure out how do we incorporate these Agile principles into a management style. Beyond just saying, oh, we want, servant leadership. What are some of the ways that the actual organization can go about structuring their company? So I came up with this little idea. I kind of jotted it down in a Reddit, and I gave it a name which I'm not totally sold on just yet. Let me transition over here to my slide deck. So I'm, at least for now, calling it Extreme Agile because I think it's really kind of taking the idea of Agile, putting it to the extreme, using some of those extreme programming principles and practices as part of the foundation of what I was envisioning for this new system. And, this is just one of the possible ways. I'm not saying that this is the way your particular organization should go, but if you were to ask me, I think this is probably the highest set of ideals. And I'm sure there's things about this that I have not fully considered. And so I'm kind of putting this out there for you guys to challenge me on my ideas and tell me, maybe not necessarily where I'm wrong. I mean, you could certainly tell me where I'm wrong, but maybe ways of improving this thing. And maybe making it kind of something that the community can own and kind of present to management as the way that they want to be organized. Okay, that's kind of the goal, is to put something out there for us as developers to say, hey, and we're a little tired of this management top-down approach, command and control approach of managing us while we still try to remain agile. This is kind of what we would like to see in terms of how we are organized. So this little talk is called Extreme Agile, a new way to scale. And so I want to first start off with some objectives. I'm going to talk about understanding the overall problem. We're going to establish a better team composition. We're going to think through some working scenarios with that team composition. And then we're going to kind of take a look at, is organizing by domain better? Because that's something that some businesses are doing. And it's kind of where we're leading to in the previous slides. And then finally, the Extreme Agile Team Lifecycle, which I think is really the heart and soul of what I think a proper working Agile team could look like in a scaled system. Okay? So, first and foremost, wow, what is going on there? Architecture based on organization. So siloed teams based on skill and architecture is kind of how most businesses, I think, currently organize their pool of talent, right? Typically your teams are organized according to, unless you're on a full stack development team that's specifically focused on full stack implementation and development, most of the time you're being kind of siloed into these different teams based upon specific skills that you have, or particular parts of the architecture. So you end up with these shared stories that cross over all of these different pieces of the architecture, right? You have maybe a team of people who are just focused on incepting stories, trying to find out what the business needs are of whoever their client is. And then you might take those ideas from the inception team and pass them along to a UX team who just, their sole focus is on trying to design and maybe wireframe up what the new look would be for the user, for the client. And then they kind of toss those things over the fence to the front end team. And the front end team works on the story a little bit, and then they get done with their piece, and then they toss it over to the back end team, and back end team does their thing, but they know that there's going to have to be some database stuff that gets done, so they toss it over to the database team. The database team does their thing. We have some sort of code review possibly in there. We've got a QA team in this intermixed with this whole process that probably has some sort of gatekeeping responsibility before it gets deployed. And then finally, when this thing is completely approved, then it goes to the DevOps team who actually does the deployment of the thing, right? That's something that can happen. And there's an intermix of different things. This is obviously a very expanded example. Your company organization and structure may be something completely different than this. I understand that. But I think that we could all agree that the typical structure that you see in enterprise looks a little bit something like this, right? Teams that are organized according to some sort of layer of architecture or set of skills, right? So what's the problem with doing that? Why is it that we're doing that? Why is that a bad thing? Well, let me just kind of break this down into two pieces. Something that I call communication queue. Okay, this is a amount of time from when something when things are being communicated, okay, especially between teams, which we're going to see here. And then in this darker blue is the actual work effort, right? The effort that's actually being applied to the story. So we start off with a user story, which one of these days I'm going to talk about breaking down. I already gave you guys a user story video earlier. You should definitely go check that out. I'll probably post a little thing up at the top here that says the link to where that video is. But I actually want to redo that one because I've added a little extra to the original. But anyway, so the team receives, or the user story goes in through this inception process, right? We figure out what that user story should be, along with like some use cases, some workflows, some product requirements, right? That's collected up front by some sort of team that's organized in order to go capture those requirements from the customer, right? And then there's some sort of period of time where the inception team then passes that information along to the UX team. And then the UX team does their little bit of work, and then they have to kind of document it and catalog what they've done. And then they toss it over the fence to the next team. It was the front end. The front end does their bit of work on it, right? They've got some sort of Scrum or Agile Kanban board that they may be using, or some sort of Jira ticket process, that all of this is being tracked through. So all along the way, people are typing out their notes and their comments and all that good stuff, trying to communicate to the next team what was done on the ticket and what needs to be done on the ticket, right? So we keep moving through this process, through team by team by team. And you'll notice that between each team, there is this bit of queue time where communication is being cataloged and documented and then read by the next team. And the other thing to think about here is that most likely that whenever a team receives that story on their backlog, they won't be able to get to it until at least the next iteration. So if you are having, let's say you guys are a pretty well or organized agile team, and your iterations, your sprints are only 1 week long, and you guys really pride yourselves on 1 week long. But if you are organized according to these architectural silos, the problem is every single time that the story gets tossed over to the fence to the next team, it won't go on their backlog. It won't be worked on in the next sprint until the next sprint. So you could have, if you have this kind of structure, it could be 6 to 7 weeks before a story actually gets done from the time that it was incepted. That's a long time for a story to get done, right? That's a very long time to have to wait. So, and then if you think about teams, most teams are somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks on their iterations. So you're talking about, twice to, multiply 6 by 2 to 4, you're talking about 24 weeks possibly for one story to get completed. That is a very long time for a story to get worked on. Okay. So overall, what we end up with is about 1/6 of the time working on a story is just the communication parts, just this queue time between the different teams. And we know this, this has actually been fairly well studied. There was a book by Fred Brooks called Mythical Man Month, which this statistic is actually from that book. Is about 1/6 of the time is spent on just the communication. And so the real problem is communication is slowing down your stories, right? The way that you are communicating is actually causing a slowdown in your stories. But it actually stems from this organization that the business has structured all these teams around. So this is not exactly the best. I kind of messed up on this slide. I'll have to go back and fix it. Good thing I know that now. But basically, the solution is what we call a whole team approach. Let me kill my camera here just for a second so you guys can see. So the solution is a whole team approach. You take each one of those layers of the architecture and you just simply ensure that one member of the team one or more members of the team have the ability to manage that particular piece of the architecture so that an entire team can tackle the whole story from beginning to end, right? From when the story is incepted all the way to the point where it is deployed. It's a fairly typical strategy. A lot of teams are doing this now. A lot of businesses are organizing according to this whole team approach. Or you might have a team of full stack developers, and the idea is that the full stack developers, every single person on the team has all of these skills. And so you don't need to worry about specific individuals containing these particular skills. Instead, you know that everybody on the team has all of them. That's kind of where the industry has started to go to. But you could definitely structure your whole team approach in this particular way, where each layer of the architecture can be handled by one or more team members. Okay, so with that, let me bring myself back into frame here. So let's take a look at some scenarios. If we try to do this whole team approach where one or more individuals, oops, I forgot to transition that. There we go. So let's say that we have the whole team approach where one or more individuals have knowledge of that particular application layer or that particular, technology architectural layer. So let's say that with that team structure, you do an individual effort. So each one of the pieces of effort is something that one person is working on. So let's just do a quick little comparison of that scenario against, again, these siloed teams. So I've just got here up on the screen the siloed teams, the little graph that I had of siloed teams with the effort and the communication cues between each one of those individual efforts. Well, if we think about this same scenario in terms of individuals working on the story, well, now you have, again, still some communication cues, but they're going to be a smaller surface of communication issues because we're going to be working inter-team, right? We're going to be working within the team to pass along the stories between each individual. So along the way, what you have is still some sort of communication cue, but it's been shifted to some sort of tooling, right? Either Zoom or Jira or a Kanban board or Slack messaging. And then there's code reviews that have to be done. And then there's some sort of pull request that might be a part of the code review, might be separate, depends on how you guys are doing that. But there's all these different little bits of queue still involved, but they're more or less based around the tooling that the team is using in order to kind of progress the story along within the team. And so communication is just basically more about the tools. But there's a lot less difficulty doing that communication because you can do stand-ups, you can have the daily stand-ups, you can have the, to where you're talking about what it is you did, what you're doing, etc. And that's all designed in order to help alleviate some of this communication issues, right? If you know that you're going to be next up on the story, you're going to be listening intently to what I'm telling you the progress is on my story. And you're going to be looking at my Jira tickets and my Jira notes. And when I'm done with my piece of it, I'm going to Slack you a message that says, hey, I'm done with my little piece. It's now yours. Can you go work on it? And then eventually we have some sort of code review that has to be done to ensure that the quality of this whole thing, maybe it's a whole team code review, maybe it's a tech lead that's doing the code review. Then we have some sort of pull request that the DevOps are going to make, and they might have some sort of review process, and they're going to run all their gambit of tests and things like that. So there's still like QA going on here. There's still some, but it's just the focus of the communication is now shifted from team to team to person within the team, which means that the amount of time it takes to communicate those things is a little bit less, but we're still kind of using tools to do it. So this is definitely better. We can see on the right side here the time that was gained, right? We saw this little bit of sliver of gained time. This is just a comparison. That little green bar here is the amount of time that the team has basically taken back as compared to if we tried to silo the teams, right? So it's better, but there's still a communication queue, and it's still gated by knowledge transfer. This is still not agile. And in fact, if you are skilled at all at taking a look at what waterfall process looks like, doesn't both of these charts look like waterfall? Right? This looks like waterfall. Like, do this little bit, and there's some sort of gate. Then there's this little bit, then some sort of gate, then this little bit, then some sort of gate, right? Before a story can progress, it goes from gate to gate. The only difference here that we've been able to do because of iterations is essentially make it so that the gating is based upon communication instead of some sort of testing or some sort of process, right? Instead, the gates are the communication gates. Like how quickly can we transfer story from one individual or from one team to the next? And so we're still essentially doing waterfall. It's just that the gate is the communication gap. So this is still not agile. And in fact, because all we've done is shift the communication problem over to the tools and the process, that even further solidifies the idea that we're not agile because we're not focused on individuals and interactions anymore. We are focused on the process and the tools, right? We're using Slack and Kanban and Jira and all of these things in order to facilitate the communication. So that means that we're not actually emphasizing the individuals and interactions of the individuals. So I would argue this is, even though we have a whole team approach, even though we're still doing iterations, even though we have Scrum in place and we're doing stand-ups and we're doing retro boards and we're doing Kanban, I'm not convinced that necessarily makes you agile. I don't think anybody's convinced that this is agile. From the people that I've worked with and the people that I see complaining all the time about agile, this is a lot of what they're typically doing. They're not actually doing agile. It looks like agile. It kind of, if you squint your eyes just the right way and we're doing retro boards, so we're doing retro, so we're doing the feedback part of things, and we are kind of talking and we're discussing things a little bit better. We got the stand-ups, right? That in and of itself does not mean that the team is agile. I'm sorry. I just don't buy that. Okay? I don't buy that. So let's talk about a second scenario. Let's talk about the paired programming scenario. So once again, I just want to start to show you again. This bar up above is the original baseline of the siloed teams, where you're taking a story, you're working on your little piece of it, then you're throwing it over the fence to the next team, right? And in the process to do that communication, you're jotting down your notes, your comments, etc., and redefining those stories as typically some sort of technical task for the next team to work on and do. Okay, that's what this top bar represents. So now let's assume that you have a whole team approach, but you are paired programming between the individuals on your team. So once again, we have the inception process. We've got the acceptance criteria that is born out from that inception process. And for those of you who don't know what acceptance criteria is, it's essentially a set of typically in behavior-driven development, we write these out as given when thens. So given this initial state of the system, when this particular action is done by the user, then this should be the end result or behavior of the system. So that's kind of the acceptance criteria. You write these acceptance criteria based upon the stories that are born from the inception process, okay? And so there has to be some sort of communication from whoever incepted it. And you could maybe have the whole team in the inception process. That's certainly a good strategy, but not always, you can't always do that. So sometimes you just get like a tech lead or an architect or somebody that's maybe a product owner if you're doing Scrum that gets involved in those discussions with the customer to figure out what the user stories are and the acceptance criteria for those things, okay? Then they have to communicate those things. They jot all these things down in a Jira board or GitHub issues tracker or something like that. And you then talk to the team about the backlog of all these user stories and things that were born from that inception. You talk to the team and tell them what we're going to be working on next. And it could be through some sort of large organizational iteration process or iteration planning meetings, right? That's quite often, especially if you're doing SAFe, you have these large company-wide or train-wide, everybody takes 2 days to plan their next 3 months ahead of time. And part of that is figuring out what these acceptance criteria is and what some of these stories are from the product owners' conversations with the domain owners. So anyway, if we're continuing to focus on this individual process, right? Paired programming process now. So if we're paired programming, which basically means that two people are working on a story at one time, right? So two people are working on the story, and you can swap around people. You can have those two people working on the story from beginning to end, or you can sometimes swap out people of the pair based upon the skill that is required for that particular piece of it. So, you and I might work on something for a half a day, and then, somebody else and I might swap. And then that person, has a little bit more knowledge about a particular area that the story's stuck on. And that helps kind of move the story along, is because we're trading out skill sets to work on a story at the more on demand that it's required. You don't always have to do that. Sometimes you have two, what we call junior pairs, working on a story because they're trying to educate themselves on something and they're trying to learn and they're trying to grow with it. So that's perfectly acceptable in a lot of these pair programming situations, is that neither one of them actually know how to implement the story, and it's kind of a discovery phase for both people. Like, this is just what we're going to do. We're going to take some time this iteration to learn how to do this stuff. But what we've done now, so we can see that there's a significant shrinkage of the queue time, the amount of time that it takes to transfer information from one person to the next or one pairing to the next. And it's actually the actual knowledge transfer of the story is happening during the working process, during the effort. And it's no longer a part of the communication queue, right? The knowledge transfer part of things. So before, when we were doing individual efforts, there had to be some sort of knowledge transfer that was being done through the tooling. But in this case, we're able to kind of carry along the context of the story from pair to pair, because typically one person of the pairing will have previously worked on that story. So you can kind of maintain this contextual thread all the way through from the beginning to the end. So now the effort part of working on the story contains all of that knowledge transfer, and it's no longer stuck in a communication queue. But now we still have this little bit of time here where we have to think about how we're going to select our pairs. Who's going to work on this story today? Who's going to work on the story with me? And we still have some sort of PR request and code review typically. Towards the end, we're still going to have some sort of team lead kind of look over things, or maybe the DevOps person or the QA person will kind of have to review the code and make sure that it actually solves the problem or, actually properly implements things. So there's still a little bit of kind of this time between stages that can occur where, we're transferring a story between pairs and we're determining which pair is going to work on that story today. And then towards the end, we've got some sort of PR request and code review that can happen. Now, this is definitely a much more significant amount of time gained. You'll see that we've gotten actually about the same amount of time as one team would potentially work on that story, right? Theoretically. So we've gained a significant amount of time here in doing this. And the other thing is, so we got the knowledge transfer. We've got smaller communication queues. And I think that this really, let me just kind of get my way here. Let me hide my camera again. This gives us the maximum team throughput while maintaining quality. Because if you were to have six team members, right, 6 members of a team, you could have 3 stories being worked on at once. If you had 8 members of a team, you could have 4 stories at once, etc. So you could have a maximum team throughput, right? You have the maximum number of stories being worked on while still maintaining the context of the story all the way through from beginning to end. And I think you have the quality of the story that's being delivered is thoroughly vetted out because you have all these different people giving the different kinds of input on how to complete the story. So you have maximum team throughput, the maximum number of stories being able to be worked on while still maintaining the quality that you would expect from the team. Okay, so that's kind of where pair programming really helps. But there are still some surfaces here that we might be able to get rid of, right? Some of this communication queue that could be removed from the system. And that's where I think mob programming really kind of comes in. Let me bring my camera back in. Unhide that, transition back. There we go. So, okay, let's talk about the third scenario, which is mob programming. Let's say your team was organized to mob program. And I typically, just to give you kind of a precursor here, I typically advise teams to do both pair programming and mob programming, depending upon the story that needs to be worked. If it's a story that is highly complex and looks like it requires a bunch of different varieties of skills in order to complete it, then you should probably mob it. If it is something that is just a fairly simple, straightforward story, then you could just have the pairing. But this is what it would look like if we were to mob. And mob programming essentially means every member of the team is working on the same user story at the same time. That's essentially what mob programming is. Everybody is working on it at once. Technically, a mob could be 3 or more people working on a story. So you could, if you had a team of 6, you could have 2 mobs going. But I typically think of mob programming as a whole team approach per story. So what you end up with, though, is you'll notice that there are no communication gaps. Yes, there's some border edges between the work efforts based upon the part of the stack that's being worked on, or the part of the architecture that's being worked on. And you have this little tiny blip here for acceptance criteria, assuming that your product owner or your team lead or whoever is incepting the product, or incepting the project, I should say, or product, however you guys are organizing that. There's still that inception phase that has to then be transferred to the team and discussed with the team. But notice that this is the maximum amount of time that you could possibly gain, because since the whole team is working on the same problem at once, there's no throwing over the fence between pairs or individuals or teams, because everybody is in the same room working on the same problem. Now, another thing that is kind of fascinating to witness when you see mob programming happening is you may have one person that is actually doing the coding, right? In a mob programming scenario, you have one person fixed to the keyboard, mouse, and monitor. The monitor is typically very big, so everybody can see it, right? It's like a big TV on the wall. Everybody is gathered around a table or something. And you are all looking at essentially the same screen while one person is typing out on the keyboard. You can also do some shared stuff, like some people, everybody around the desk can have their own laptops out, so they can kind of be doing some research in the background, and then they can have kind of these side conversations. So maybe while the UX team is kind of figuring out the wireframing of things, the front-end development team, the front-end person and the back-end person can be having a discussion about what the RESTful API interface should look like, so that when the front end is talking about the fetch process, what are the endpoints that the front-end team wants to hit from the back end? What kind of object data, what type of model object do you want? What kind of, how do you want to post this? Do you want to put this? Like, you guys kind of can discuss that kind of structure while another piece of this is being worked on at the same time. So you have these asynchronous communications going on in the background, even though the flow of the work is synchronous, right? It's all kind of happening in order, but you have all of those discussions that would have typically have been placed aside to some other later time and date. Now they're actually a part of this one effort happening at the same time. So that's really good because you have those kind of discussions. You can bring in all sorts of people. Typically, the argument against mob programming, these arguments are one of them I really kind of understand is that I get burned out because I'm constantly working in this fashion. But the other one that I think is kind of, I wouldn't say nonsense, but it's kind of like, that's not really the fault of mob programming, is, well, what about if we can't decide? What if we have some disagreement or some sort of, we don't believe that two or more of us don't think that that's the right way to do something. Well, that's where you come up with things like decider protocols, right? You have some sort of decision-making process that assume from the get-go, you guys are going to have some sort of disagreement. So figure out now, before you guys start this process, how are you guys going to resolve that? What are you guys going to do in order to answer that question? Okay, so that's something that mob teams do all the time, is they have some sort of decider protocol that helps them figure out, okay, if we have a conflict of how we think this is supposed to go, what is the process we undergo in order to determine as a team how we're going to move forward? So that's not a thing. That's not a flaw of mob programming. That's just a communication thing that instead of being delayed to some other time later on down the road, you guys can all address it because you're all in the same room and you can all decide. Instead of having to arrange some sort of meeting later on down the road that, Joe and I have a disagreement, let's all get together in this meeting and waste a half hour when we could be doing it right now while we're all working on this problem. That makes a little bit more sense. And we all understand the context of the problem because we're all working on the problem at the same time. We don't have to rediscuss what the context is of the problem before we can before we can conduct the meeting. All of that stuff becomes problematic. Okay, so mob programming. I love it. I think it's great. It solves a lot of problems. It's not for everybody. I totally understand that. And I'm not suggesting that every single team needs to always mob program at all times. But it's definitely one of the scenarios that can be used to resolve, to make stories happen. So the benefits of this are there's no code review. We've eliminated that. There's no code review step. Everybody, including the tech lead, is going to be involved in this process. The QA, the DevOps, all of those people are in on building this thing. So there's no need for a code review. There's no need for stand-ups. Why do a stand-up? Everybody's there. Everybody knows what everybody's working on because you're all working on the same thing. There's no need for a stand-up. Same thing with the Kanban board. Believe it or not, you don't need a Kanban board. Why would you need one? Again, we're not doing swimming lanes. We're not watching the progress of the story because we all know what the progress is on the story. Why do you need a Kanban board? There's no need to even communicate via Slack for this. I'm not saying you get rid of Slack. It's not like you just get rid of Slack. You still need to communicate with other teams and, management and, you want to have some discussion and good times, right? But as far as the work that's being done on the story, there's no need for Slack. And then finally, there's no communication queue here, right? Other than that upfront, acceptance criteria where the team lead or the PO or whoever kind of discusses the storyline or the workflow, the use cases, that sort of thing. They've got to discuss those things with the team, but that's it. Like, that's the only bit of communication that needs to be done because from that point on, the whole team's just going to work on it. Also, we get the benefits of the knowledge transfer that can occur, right? Because if I'm a back-end person, I want to see how front-end does their work. I'm there. I'm watching them and I'm doing it right along with them. And maybe we even make it so that I drive. Maybe I'm the back-end person. I want to learn more about how to do front-end, so I'm actually going to drive. You guys tell me what I need to type on this keyboard. Where do I need to go next? What are the things I need to type out? So I can learn by driving, what we call driving. There's driver navigator. I'm not going to get into all that, but you guys can go look up how to do driver navigator in these mob programming scenarios or pair programmings. But so this does give us also the quickest story delivery time, right? Because we've eliminated all those pieces of communication that have to occur. There's none of those little gaps of time of trying to communicate what's being worked on the story from one person or from one team to the next. So we have zero communication queue time, right? Because it's all happening real time, on time, at the time that it's necessary. And then this also, I think, produces the highest quality code because you have all the experts in the room that can identify and pick apart things. And that sometimes does temporarily slow down the progress because you're kind of picking it apart, but you also ensure the quality. And that picking apart would have happened anyway. It's just that you're doing it in the room at the same time, right? So it doesn't actually slow things down. It just means that you've taken that piece of time that would have happened later on, and you've moved it to the front part while we're actually doing the development as a team. Now, the downside of this, I think the major downside of this for a lot of teams is they look at this and they say, well, wait a minute, if the whole team is only working on one story at a time, that means we're not getting as many stories done. And that is true. You're going to have fewer stories actually worked in an iteration by taking this type of approach. So that's just something to consider. But I have a caveat to that, because this talk and what I've been thinking about is this extreme agile process, which actually addresses this very thing, or part of this indirectly addresses this issue. So let's talk now about the other way to organize. Did I not? That's weird. I don't know why my slides are kind of all at once jumping on my screen, but there we go. So let's say that we did silo teams. So let's say, okay, Steve, we took your advice. We are organized according to domains, what we call domains, which for those of you who are not familiar with the term domain, it's essentially one piece of the business that's kind of, like it's one part or piece of the application that is typically like resource driven. So it's like one particular area of the business that gets worked. And we typically associate things like titles and roles to these things. So like accounting, or building the POS system, or managing vendors, or billing, right? All of these kind of pieces of the application, these are all different domains of the application. And I could go on forever about domain-driven development, but essentially you're trying to organize and you're thinking about these team structures now according to, you're wanting to organize them and hand them stories according to these little pieces and parts of the overall system. And we organize these teams then into what type of domain that they specialize in. Are they kind of the team that handles accounting? Are they the type of team that handles internal processes? Are they handling vendors, right? So each team is kind of associated with one particular part of what the overall business purpose is. So is this any better that we organize the teams according to these domains? And I think what you end up with is really just kind of the exact same scenario where each one of these teams is bound to their domain. One team works on the ordering system, one team works on the inventory system, one team works on the shipping, one team works on accounting, one team works on billing, merchant services, and one's on vendors. And a story can end up crossing over all of these, right? Like if I want to place an order, if I went to your website and I wanted to place an order, it would hit every single one of these domains. So once again, we have a story that has to cross all these boundaries. Are we actually any better? Right? Because once again, we're back to the ordering team works on this little piece of the story and then tosses it over to inventory, and then they work on this little piece and then they toss it over to shipping, and right? And you might have somebody that kind of bounces between all these different domains and kind of works on what we call the bounded context. But this is just this is still kind of the same thing, right? It's just that the teams are organized a little differently, but it's still the same problem. So what the heck, Steve? Like, you just took us through this journey of understanding this communication queue only to tell us that the system that you just told us to organize according to has the exact same problems. You're right. That is kind of my point. That even though the organizations, even if they go to this whole team approach, and the answer that most companies are trying to implement in order to solve the problem is actually just the same problem regenerated in a different way. So, okay, where do we go from here? Well, let's just take a look at some of the conflicting values I think that are happening here. So the knowledge transfer about a domain cannot happen if only one team works on the domain, right? So we still have that knowledge transfer issue. How do we get knowledge about a domain transferred over to other people if a team is siloed around a domain and nobody else enters into that domain, right? Is that any better than an architectural way of doing things? Not really. Okay, so we need to have some sort of knowledge transfer about domains, and that can't happen if one team works on a domain, if only one team works on a domain. Skill sets should be made readily available to the stories that require them, right? So whenever we have a particular piece of a story that needs to be worked on, we need to make sure that somebody within the team has the skill set to manage that particular challenge. So we should make the skill sets readily available to handle that particular piece of the story. Okay, so that's another value that I think we should have. Communication across teams is a waste of time no matter how the teams are organized. Okay, that communication across teams is wasted time. And these two themes seem a little bit weird to say. Like the first one and the third one are almost at odds with each other. How can we have knowledge transfer across domains if we're not allowed to do communication across domains, across teams that are organized by domains? So there's some inherent problems with that. Also, organizing people according to skills. So the first three things are kind of agile things, right? Knowledge transfer, making sure that skill sets are readily available. Communication across teams we need to slim that down. We need to have good communication, but we kind of want to make sure that communication is not a problem within the organization, right? So those are kind of agile values. Actually, not values. They're actually more closely aligned with the principles. But the business, the organization, is trying to think about how to organize people according to skills to help the HR department determine the employment levels. Like, how do we determine who to hire and which team to place that person on? So a lot of businesses have gone to that architectural style because of this very thing, where they have to determine, HR has to decide what are the skills that we're going to hire for, and then where do we place them on that team? And then it becomes a matter of, well, we have 5 members on this team. We need to have a minimum of 6, so we need to go hire somebody to fill in that team. So that's kind of one of the things that the enterprise is concerned with. The next is work on a domain can be done fastest by people who understand the domain. So again, this is kind of another challenge of how we're trying to organize the teams, is that the work, if you have something that needs to be done on a domain, it's best to have somebody who understands that domain do the work. Otherwise, somebody has to kind of fumble around with the context and understanding the overall thing before they can go work on it, right? And then finally, there's this little pesky law called Conway's Law, which basically says that organizations design systems that mirror their own communication structure. And architectural layers is the most obvious way to organize communication, right? Those architectural layers and passing on communication between those layers makes the most logical sense to a lot of people, okay? Even going to a domain organization, a domain-based organization, that's a bit of a mind warp for a lot of people. And so we start to switch to things like, how do we do some sort of message queue system and send messages back and forth and fire off, if you're doing reactive development, you're doing, events and messages that way. So, okay, how do we then, since we have this Conway's Law in place that says that the communication structure is essentially going to dictate the design of the system, what is it that we can do organization-wise to avoid some of these pitfalls that I've been talking about, and also to eliminate the communication problems? So I sat down and I thought about this thing again. I thought about this team composition. I thought about who was involved in it. And I was thinking this tech lead position could really handle some interesting responsibilities, okay? And I think that, and this kind of comes from some of the thoughts, again, that I read in Mythical Man Month regarding the way that Fred Brooks saw as a competent model of how teams could be organized and operate is around the surgical team, like an actual surgical team in a hospital. You have the lead surgeon who's focused on the overall task and kind of manages and does a lot of the work. It doesn't have to actually do a lot of the work, but kind of monitors and makes sure that the work that's being done on the patient is following, and oftentimes gets their hand very dirty, and they may actually be the only person doing the work. But there's a whole support staff around that surgeon, right? There's a whole team of specialists around that person to facilitate what the surgeon is trying to do. So that using that as kind of a model and thinking about the tech lead as kind of that lead surgeon, we could have the tech lead help incept the idea, right? Incept the, when we're talking about inception, we're talking again about deriving user stories and workflows and use cases and even some acceptance criteria. They're going to be talking to the domain expert, which is the business owner that kind of wants this thing from the application. The tech lead can talk to that business owner and say, what do you want from the system? And start to extract those user stories and use cases. Then that tech lead can, while they're working on, the surgery, if you will, working on the story, working on the workflow, working on the use cases, they will have full knowledge of the domain, right? Of what it is that needs to be talked about. What, for this particular workflow, what are the different pieces that need to be worked on? Okay, and the tech lead's going to have that understanding and knowledge. So while the whole team is working on it, there will be essentially an expert in the room at all times that the team can constantly ask for information from. And then the tech lead should be the one actually forming the team based upon the skills required. And that's kind of, you might be able to start to see where I'm going with this just based upon that one statement. The tech lead should form the team, right? Or the tech lead should form the team based upon the skills required for the use cases that have been extracted during the inception, right? If our goal is to have the skills necessary to fulfill a story, then we should be able to have somebody say, I need these people that have this set of skills to tackle this set of stories. And that should be a dynamic thing. That shouldn't be a structured team that exists indefinitely. That should be something that gets comprised of every time some set of new workflow or new set of use cases emerges. You then reorganize the team. So now the tech lead ensures that the story has cohesion. This is, again, kind of following along that Fred Brooks Mythical Man Month idea that there should be one person that's kind of the mastermind that is kind of ensuring the whole thing has the integrity of the story, right? We have some sort of cohesion of understanding, and that really because one person essentially holds the model in their brain. Now, this can be transferred, right? This knowledge is hopefully being transferred during the process. So if the tech lead has a leave of absence for whatever reason, the team can still continue to work on it because hopefully by that time, the stories have been dispersed, the acceptance criteria has been dispersed, and then all those little tiny contextual things are really just kind of making sure that the tech lead can make sure the team is staying on track, but doesn't necessarily have to continuously put up the guardrails all the time. And the team itself can start to answer some of their own questions and resolve problems. Because, come on, they're all very special, skilled, brilliant people working on the team. You don't always need a tech lead to answer every single question. But having a tech lead available can help ensure that this thing stays on the rails, right? And we're not diverting into areas that we don't need to go into. But having that one person there to kind of help ensure that things are staying on track is a good thing. It's just not a always necessary thing. Let's just put it that way. So developers are pooled according to skills. So developers, we pool the different developers according to their skills. So I'm envisioning these pools of people, like every single developer that comes on staff is essentially kind of categorized according to their skill set. And you could categorize them according to the skills they have and according to the skills that they want. So these are the skills I have, these are the skills I want, and based upon those things, now the tech lead, when they're trying to devise of this team, when they're trying to think of the team that they want to comprise to tackle these sets of user stories and use cases, they can go look at this list of all of the available developers. what the skills are that the developers have, what the skills are that the developers need, and the tech lead can say, okay, I want these 6 people on my team. I want these 7 people on my team, right? Because those are the skill sets that I'm going to need in order to fulfill this set of use cases. That's the idea that I think I really kind of came up with, is we should have this continuous regeneration of the organization. The team should be constantly undergoing metamorphosis and change, and those changes and those decisions about how they're being constructed should be based upon what the needs of the current stories are, right? It's a pretty simple, I think, basic idea. So one of the other things about this is, because we have a tech lead that could be there and understands the domain, and typically a tech lead is going to have full stack knowledge, right? There's always going to be somebody who can cover when an absent member, when somebody's absent, right? Somebody has a leave of absence. And even if the tech lead leaves, the whole team will, by that time, because of the acceptance criteria and the transfer of knowledge that happens during the what I call the refinement process. Well, I don't call it that necessarily, but that's what I've included in here. That process of discussing it with the team of what it is what is this part of the project that we're all going to be working on, that discussion helps to kind of inform the team of where everything is going. So even if the tech lead has to leave for a day or two, the team can still continue to work, right? And you have these different crossovers of skills, and even if somebody doesn't necessarily have that specific skill, there's usually some exploratory that can be done by the team. And you kind of have, I really, again, like the idea of mob programming things. So you kind of have everybody in the room all together all the time, working on each individual story. And finally, all knowledge required to finish the use case workflow is on the team, right? There's no extra communication necessary. This goes back to that whole team approach, right? There's no additional knowledge. There's no need to contact other teams. There's no need to communicate with somebody else, because everybody that could possibly work on this story or work on these sets of stories is in the room. That's why the tech lead has comprised of that group of people in the way that they did, so that we have everybody that is necessary available to work on the story. So this is essentially, and I forgot to kind of go down. Why is that doing that? That is so weird. So we have this inception process. This is what I call the Extreme Agile team lifecycle. So we have this inception process. Ooh, okay, there we go. We have this inception process where the tech lead extracts use cases and user stories, and possibly even the domain model, which is a good thing to do if you're at all into DDD, domain-driven design. But you have the tech lead extract the use cases, user stories, and the domain model while they're having the discussion with the domain experts, right? So we're getting personas. I forgot to put personas up there too, but you're getting personas, use cases, user stories, and possibly a domain model while you're having this discussion with the domain experts, the people that are the actual business owners that want this piece of this system to be built. Then you organize the team, right? So the tech lead will determine the team's size and the composition based upon the required skills to fulfill these sets of use cases and user stories. Okay, so we comprise the team, right? The team lead, the tech lead, looks at the pool of talent that is available, looks at the skill sets that those people have, and determines, I want these people on my team to work on this. Okay? Then we go through a refinement process. This is where the team learns about and refines the existing stories from the tech lead. So sometimes a story may not be written exactly the right way, and the team, as they discuss it, they realize, you know what, there's other stories in this that we just simply, that the tech lead didn't quite extract from this. So you kind of have this process where the team kind of looks at the whole total workflow and says, you know what, I see some other stories in here I think we need to get worked on too, until you eventually build out the full backlog of all of the items that the team needs to work on. Okay? So you have this refinement process that explores and maybe notices some other stories and acceptance criteria that needs to be built out. And also in that process, the team is learning about the work that they're about to embark upon, right? They learn about the context. They get the information, the knowledge transfer from the tech lead or the architect about what it is that is the goal and the personas and where we're going with this particular set of use cases. So then we move on to the building phase, which I think is everybody kind of understands what that is. Develop the code required to fulfill the use case workflows. Then we do a retro. So once we're done building, right? Once we're done building out this thing, we do a retro. We do a retrospective when we reflect on the team working process. Notice that this retro is happening after the end of workflow. And I think that this is, I think you need to understand one of the concepts I have here that I didn't put down was that these workflows are very thinly sliced. You work on essentially one workflow. So one team works on one workflow. Okay. It's not feature driven. It's workflow driven. It's use case driven. So when I have a use case, okay, so we're talking about 1, maybe 2 weeks for a team to work on something. That's the ideal, is 1 to 2 weeks, somewhere in that range. And it is a range. No longer am I trying to, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but no longer am I holding teams to a specific time span. I'm not saying an iteration is 1 week and therefore all this work needs to be done in this week. No. What I'm talking about is this is a workflow and the team is going to work on the workflow. And they're going to see it from beginning to end. But it's a very small piece of the overall pie. Okay? It's just one workflow. Once the retro is completed, the team actually disbands. They're done. The team is disbanded. Now, they may work together again later on if, the tech lead says, these two people really worked well together. I'd like to have them again on my next team if they're available. That could definitely happen. But we're no longer keeping teams together just to keep them together, right? Instead, you disband them. You release them back into the talent pool, back into the skills pool, so that they could possibly work on something else. Then, finally, you have an education phase. And this is another piece of this that I really wanted to make sure I added. Just kind of moving off to the side here so you can see this. Employees not active will spend time upskilling. So this is where it's kind of that lull between, I just got done working on this workflow, this set of use cases. I've got a little bit of time between the next time I get called up. Let's take some of this time to just kind of upskill. Like maybe the business offers some upskilling courses, right? Like maybe they just say, here's some Udemy, here's a free Udemy license or something. I don't know. Whatever they want to do in order to upskill. Maybe ideally they would hire a company like Galvanize to do some of that upskilling. But, you could have an education phase so that after the team is done with this, everybody kind of has a little break, right? Because we just got done with this kind of intense process. Let's have a little break, maybe educate ourselves, have a little team, have some discussions back and forth with other people, maybe even with the same skill sets that I have, to communicate on the work that we just did in case those people end up working on the same things. Okay? So this is kind of just get a good look at that. You might want to take a screen capture of that if you want. This is what I'm calling the Extreme Agile Team Lifecycle. And it is a life cycle that goes from inception to all the way to being disbanded, and then an education phase between when the team is disbanded and when a next inception occurs. Okay? So, what are some of the benefits? Well, it looks like I gave the punchline away there. That's not supposed to appear until the end, and I forgot to hide it. But essentially, let me just go up through these one at a time. So teams are built with a whole team approach, right? That's that whole team approach we were talking about. Team size and composition is tied to the scope of the user stories and the use cases. Okay? So the team size and composition is directly proportional to the work that needs to be done. And I don't know of an HR manager that would hate that. Right? Like, what do you mean the team size and composition is tied to the scope of the work? What do you mean by that? Like, everybody from the CEO down would love to know that that's the case, right? So you could get a ton of buy-in from management if this is what you're wanting to employ. Skills are definitely better utilized within the organization, I think, right? Because the skills are being made available and targeted to what the tech lead determines is necessary for that story. And again, you could have your set of skills be listed as what you have and what you want, right? So if I want to learn more about front end, I'm a back end developer. I want to learn a little bit more about front end. I might suggest on my little, on my sheet that says, what I know and what I want to know. And then the tech leads, when they're looking through the list of people that are available, they see that I want to learn more about front end, and they may go, okay, let's bring that person on. They want to know about more front end. So the team leads can kind of help organize and pick people, not just because of what the skills are that they have, but also the skills that they want to have. Okay. No communication queue between teams is necessary, because there is no domain in terms of siloed domain, right? The knowledge of the domains is not siloed. It is not belonging or beholden to just one group of people. Instead, the organization kind of shares the overall understanding of all the domains. And that's important. That's very important, because that leads us to the shared knowledge, right? So there's no communication queue between teams. We've eliminated that type of surface, right? There's no downtime between from when the story gets thrown over the fence to the next team. The effort is still iterative, just like any other agile process. We still have iterations of work being done. The stories are not constrained by time. The stories are no longer constrained by time. So what I mean by this is, if a team takes a week and a half instead of 1 week or 2 weeks, they take a week and a half. Right? Like there's no need to think in terms of iterations or in terms of time lengths as iterations. Instead, you just work until the work is done, and you don't worry about, I need to get this out the door by Friday because that's our release day. That doesn't happen anymore, because the team is just going to work until the team is done with that story. Okay? And that's especially true because you're not trying to coordinate your effort with another team. If you had to coordinate your effort with another team, then by golly, you better have your work done before XYZ time, because we got to throw it over to the next team so that it can get it in their next iteration. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. We've got to get this story done so that we can hand it over to the next team to work on before their next iteration starts. That is a conversation I hear all the time in enterprise, and it drives me insane. It should drive you insane. Okay? This process that I'm talking about, where we disband the groups and we constantly recirculate the talent pool like this, and we have a team that just kind of works on a very narrowly focused use case set, will allow for these teams to not be constrained by time and not be beholden to the next team's iteration. Okay? They just work on the thing from beginning to end until it's done. We still have the knowledge sharing that permeates the entire organization, right? Now that knowledge sharing process that includes the domain knowledge, that is now going to permeate the entire organization. You're going to have a lot of people now understanding all the different pieces of the of the application, instead of just having select few people, 5 or 6 people understanding this thing. Now everybody's going to be sharing this knowledge all the way across the entire organization and enterprise. Okay? This also, I think, leads to a lower burnout rate, because the work doesn't become monotonous, right? We've got this, you never know which part of the system you're going to be working on next. So there's always something new to learn. You've got a specific phase for education to help you upskill and get better. Like if you are set to a team that works on something and you realize, oh, there was a piece of this I didn't understand and I want to go learn that thing, you now have an education phase where you can individually go learn that thing and go educate yourself on it. So the next iteration you get put on, the next team you get put on, you have that understanding. So the burnout rate really kind of gets handled here, because the iterations are still very small, and the things that you are working on are constantly changing. So you're never bored. You're never bored. You're always working on something new, and you're always educating yourself on something new. Education phase allows for cross-pollination of ideas and upskilling, right? That's kind of what I was just talking about. There's also the ability to kind of, however the business wants to organize this education phase is entirely up to them. Either you could make it, I wouldn't suggest individual efforts where, here's a Udemy account, just go do it. I think it's better to have kind of these like, okay, classroom times. Like, let's actually set up classroom times where we have, if you're not in a working group, this is a classroom that you can go and attend. And these are, think of it kind of like, like a continuously ongoing conference that happens that's being facilitated by the business. That developers can go to these conferences and do their own speeches, do their own talks, do their own things, and learn from others and facilitate discussions. And think of it as like a classroom phase. You could definitely do that. I think that would be a better solution there during the education phase. So education phase really allows for that cross-pollination of ideas and the upskilling efforts that the company might want to undergo to help keep the teams rejuvenated and understanding and upskilled, right? There's no need for the organization to manage groups. There's no need for the organization to manage groups. You'll notice that this responsibility is based upon the tech lead who has direct knowledge of what the customer wants. And they will know best what kind of skills and how to comprise the group. They will know those things. The company, the organization, HR, they don't need to know any of those things, right? I shouldn't say HR. That's a whole other thing altogether. But the organization, the business does not to be involved in the process of managing the groups because it shouldn't be their responsibility. I mean, in the typical enterprise that we have now, that is their responsibility, which to me makes absolutely no sense because they don't necessarily all understand what the needs of the teams are. They have to listen to what the teams tell them they need on the team, right? If a team loses a person off of the team, like I've got, Shane. Shane just left the company. We're down from 6 developers to 5. We need a replacement for Shane. So the HR team or the management team comes down to the team or to the manager of the team and says, okay, well, we know that Shane left. What do you need in the next person that we bring in? Now there has to be some communication and discussion to them about like, okay, these are the things that Shane was responsible for. This is how we need to work on things. This is how we operated as a team. This is part of our culture. Like there's all this communication and download that the management team now has to try to understand the context of how the team worked together to try to figure out how to find the best natural fit for this team. Well, that doesn't exist in this system, right? The system I'm talking about, that's not a thing because there is no such thing as a static team. Teams are constantly ever changing and evolving according to the needs of the customer, which kind of falls into Conway's law, if you really think about it, right? We need to organize our team according to what the business needs are from our customers. That makes the most sense. So we constantly organize our teams according to the work that our customer says needs to be done. And we bring in the appropriate skills to fulfill those needs. And that means that we don't have to manage teams in the way that we typically do, where if we lose a particular individual, we try our best to replace that knowledge base. And then it takes 6 to 7 months before that person can get on-ramped onto what the team has been working on, right? None of that exists either because everybody's constantly learning something new and working on this different piece of the pie. That's the kind of thing that I think really would be emboldened in this type of system is that continuous education and knowledge and the uptime that it would take or the time it would take for someone to get trained on what the team is working on is essentially non-existent. You don't have that 6-month or 7-month on-ramping, or orientation, if you will, of that person to try to get used to the code base, right? Especially if you're working in pairs and mob programming, because you constantly have all of the domain experts. You have all the people working on the problem together in the same room. Fantastic. Like as a brand new person joining this team, not knowing a thing about anything, I've got 6 people around me that all do know what's going on, and I can ask them questions and see exactly where this is going. And within a matter of minutes, as things are being worked on, I will completely understand. So I think that kind of on-ramp just kind of disappears through this system. Hey everybody, Steve here in post-production. I just thought I'd mention that there's one other benefit I forgot to mention on this slide, and that is that the organization can remain focused on the highest priority items and the highest priority use cases that the company needs to tackle first. Things like compliance or bugs those can be at the very tip top of what the organization addresses. And we're no longer being structured according to the domains. So we wouldn't have just one particular team that's only focused on one domain that has a whole lot of extra bugs they got to solve before they can provide any additional value to the product. So this would actually help the entire organization stay focused on delivering the most value every single time that a new user story or use case is taken up. And that's the thing. The need to scale, right? If you need to scale up your teams, if your project starts to get larger and larger and larger, you have more work to be done. All you have to do is just add people. You don't have to do any sort of team organization. You don't have to plan up okay, who's going to be managing which team. You don't have any of that. That's gone. That whole management apparatus and infrastructure is disappeared. All you need is sufficient talent pool. Right? You just need a talent pool that's large enough to facilitate the currently ongoing work that needs to be done. And that's a simple thing, right? That's a fairly simple set that's a simple way for HR to manage their talent pool is, oh, we need more developers? Well, let's just go hire more developers. Tell me what kind of skills. Look at the talent pool that we have. Where we are, where is all of these people currently, where are the current skills being applied? Right? So looking at the current base of people that are currently working versus the people who are not working yet, I can look and see where we're missing talent in the talent pool, because this set of skills, like say DevOps, for example, let's just say you have fewer DevOps in your organization. And so all of your DevOps are working on things right now. So in your talent pool, you notice we don't have any DevOps available. So what does HR do? They know exactly who to go hire. They know to go hire people, once again, based on the architecture, based upon the skills that they know, which goes back to that slide that I showed you. I'm going to go way back here. These conflicting values, right? This one here, organizing people according to skills helps HR determine employment levels. This really resolves that problem, because now the HR can look at the amount of skills in the available talent pool of who's basically waiting to be working on something, and they can easily identify that they need to be worked on, that we need to hire people based upon those skills. So that resolves that problem as well. All right, so need to scale, just add people, and that's it. That's the extent of what I've got. Let me just go back to this one here, just in case you guys want this. I told you to take a screen grab. This is essentially my plan, and let me get my face out of this. All right, I suggest you take a screen grab of that. If you want to try this, if you want to employ this, I think this overall chart here of the team lifecycle will help you understand how the team is going to do their work, right? What is the life cycle of a team? And then, so take a quick screen grab of that. And then I also got, we could do it this way. That one there. So you might want to take a screen grab of that too, because this is going to tell you what the team composition is, right? And these are just kind of, and obviously the names could be whoever, but this kind of helps you understand overall, I think, what the team's responsibilities are. Are you already test that method? Carlos says, are you already test that method? So no, actually I have not. So I've been working with a lot of teams in a variety of different scenarios. Most commonly, the teams that I've worked on are kind of the businesses are claiming Agile, but they're organized according to architectural structure. That's the most common way that I see businesses organized. Not always the case, and not every team within an organization is based that way. Sometimes, again, I think what I also see very commonly is full stack development teams, quote unquote full stack development teams, which I've been a part of full stack development teams too. And their responsibility is to know everything about everything, like the entire product. We have to know everything, and we have to know how to go through it and solve things. But no, I have not had a chance to actually implement this system, and that's kind of why I'm presenting it. It's a brand new idea for me. It's a brand new idea that I just, after some of the work that I've been doing with all these different teams, I was like, how would I construct a organization to work? And so I'm kind of presenting this more as a thought experiment and how I would like to see maybe a team try to organize or think about organizing, and talk about some feedback. If they do decide to do that, I would love to hear some feedback about how they do it. So K Ahmed asks, why team has roles in your Agile? It's Agile, everyone is a problem solver. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so the only role, quote unquote role, would be a team lead. Okay, so if you think in terms of like Scrum, for example, you have product owners, you have Scrum masters, you possibly even have some management over that. If you're dealing with like SAFe, then you've got these people that are managing the entire release, the release train. I'm not really big on all of that extra infrastructure, and instead I'm kind of placing it more directly upon what I would consider the team lead, right? Somebody who is knowledgeable is able to collect the requirements from the customer and then understand the problem, the larger problem. And that requires some level of seniority because they're going to have some level of experience about how to understand and grasp what it is the customer wants. But then once the set of user stories, I should say, the use cases more specifically, are handed down to the team, the job or role of the team lead or the tech lead is to just make sure that the team is kind of working towards the goal correctly, right? Like we're aiming on the right track. We're not getting diverted onto what we'd call the non-goals. So typically in an inception process, you're determining the goals that particular domain expert has. So what do they want? But you also want to extract the non-goals. What are the things that this domain expert doesn't really care about? I don't need this from this product right now. So from that type of discussion that the team lead is going to have, they can then bring that information along with the personas, the use cases, and the user stories, and maybe even some acceptance criteria if they've started to roughly draft those out, can take that information to the team, and then the team kind of self-organizes around that, right? The team starts to self-organize around that. That's where I'm saying things like, do you pair program? Do you mob program? How are you guys going to do the communication? Is it going to be Slack, etc.? Are you guys going to Zoom meeting all the time? Like all of those type of organizational things are still up to the team to decide. All that you have is basically a set of requirements that are the stories that the team lead has collected. And because the tech lead has collected this information, they're going to be the most directly knowledgeable person about what those stories actually represent. So they become a knowledge base, right? They become not necessarily the person that is dictating to the team how to do it, but rather they become the person that informs the team of what the original customer wanted. So they kind of take on that PO role, that product owner role, if you will, of understanding what it is the customer needs, with the added benefit that they actually know what the developers are doing, right? They actually understand the context of what the developers are trying to do. So the quote unquote product owner, who's now just the tech lead, they understand the technology as well as what the customer is trying to do. So it is a skill set, right? That requires some level of seniority. And yes, it's kind of a role, but that's the only role. Everybody else is really just based upon skills. And the tech lead is going to say, I know that in order to accomplish these sets of stories, I'm going to need people that have these skill sets. And however they want to organize, like, again, I'm probably going to want to pull in people who want to learn something, not just a certain set of skills that they have, but also the set of skills they want to acquire. I'm going to look at that and I'm going to try to comprise my teams based upon those skills of what they have and what they want. And then I'm just going to bring them all together in the room and we're going to start to work on this thing. We're going to plan out, let the team self-organize from that point, right? Okay, team, we're going to have a general meeting up front to talk about, here's the user stories. Let's go through these. and let's see if there's any other hidden user stories in there. Let's write up some acceptance criteria for each one of these. And then we all understand the workflow. And then you guys tell me what you want to do, how you guys want to organize around this. Let me say that again because I kind of stumbled it. So K. Ahmed asks, usually PO comes from business. Should Agile team drive who they want as team lead or PO? No. The team does not does not determine who the team lead or tech lead should be. It's just simply a skill, right? To be a tech lead, you just simply have the demonstrated skill. So if you have all of the necessary skills for like the organization, the team, not the local team, but the business organization could have a certain level of talent pool that is the tech lead pool or architect pool. And then those architects and those tech leads are the ones that will essentially meet with the customer to understand what the customer wants to do, and then just simply, bring in the team, form the team based upon the skill sets. And Kalma says, cream rises to the top. Yeah, I think so. I think that you have a structure where anybody that is within the talent pool, if they can, maybe you just simply set up some sort of a board of advisors, if you will. You could do this in all sorts of ways, and this is not necessarily part of what I put together, but I might add this based upon your questions, K. Ahmed. But if I'm just off the cuff thinking about it, perhaps what you could do is have some sort of you could have a interview process whereby anybody in the talent pool that wants to become a tech lead could go through an interview process with the other tech leads and ensure that they have the skills and the ability to do it. And then you could actually make that a part of the education phase, right? So we have that education phase as part of the cycle. You could make one of the classrooms that somebody could take be a part of how do you become a tech lead. And, people can continue to educate themselves if that was a goal that they wanted to do and move up within the company. Yeah, exactly. K. Ahmed says, team respects more who rise from the ranks. Exactly. And again, I think that kind of bears some respect too, because not saying that POs don't get respect, but if a development team knows that the person that is informing them of what the customer's needs are is also a technical software development person or an architect, there's going to be a lot more mutual respect for that person, I think. They're not just perceived as an extension of the business, as an extension of their client. They are an actual knowledgeable person who fully grasps the difficulties that the team is trying to grapple with. And that means that the discussion of what that tech lead, the discussions around what the tech lead sees that the client needs can actually be properly facilitated without, and getting into some of those nitty-gritty technical details and implementation details. But if you just have a PO that doesn't have any actual development experience, it's much more difficult to have those kind of communications. And instead, what ends up happening is those questions get relayed by the PO back up to the client, and typically there's not a lot of pushback or there's not a lot of understanding. And the POs aren't always going to be extracting the right information from the clients initially either, right? Because they're not developers. They don't necessarily know what kind of questions to ask. But if it's a tech lead, somebody who's an actual developer or is knowledgeable about development, and they are the ones that are present in the room when these user stories are being crafted, they're going to be able to better understand and represent what the technology can do for the client and be able to better write those stories to make sure that they match realistic expectations of what the development team can actually perform. Okay, let me dig into this a little bit. First of all, I am saying that these teams should be organized according to workflows of use cases. Essentially, one use case with a workflow. So take a very simple example, and I've got another slide on another thing that I'm working on that talks about these workflows. Maybe I'll pull that up because I think that would offer some context to what we're talking about here. There we go. So let's take that login use case, right? Navigate, click button, enter credentials, click submit button, redirect to the account address, right? So what happens if we have bad credentials or too many attempts, right? So because of this, we would want to break out our workflow into these other branches, right? So now we say when the user clicks on the submit button, we have, if everything is okay, then they'll just be redirected to the account address. But if they enter bad credentials, they'll be redirected to the login screen and there will be an error message. If they have too many attempts, that might be another branch, right? And we need to redirect them to like some sort of failed thing. And then we might also add some sort of piece in here about not being able to log back in for 5 minutes or whatnot, right? Have their account locked for 5 minutes. So that would be possibly another piece of this too many attempts branch. But essentially, this is your workflow. And each one of these steps along the way is a user story, right? So each one of these things is a user story in and of themselves. So you have one workflow of all of these different steps that need to be taken, and you create a team around this one workflow with all the different branches that can easily be permeated based upon the discussion of what you ask the client is needed or not needed. What are the goals and non-goals of this particular iteration, or this piece of the iteration, or this piece of the domain, right? And you bear out all the different workflow pieces, and this becomes all the stories that the team will work on for that iteration. And you start to form your team based around these things. You say, okay, well, in order to do all this, and if this is a brand new story, we don't even have this navigation piece yet, well, I need to have a team that's going to be essentially full stack, because this is going to require somebody to set up the front end. There's going to be some credentials in here. The credentials are going to probably be checked against a database, which means I need a DBA and a backend RESTful API database, RESTful API person that can do the backend. I'm clearly, in order to navigate to this thing, this also means there's going to have to be some sort of deployment process. So I'm going to need somebody from DevOps to know how to do the deployment. So all of these different things, they don't specify architecture, right? Each one of these steps, the stories around each one of these steps that the user is taking does not specifically dictate or does not specifically state the architecture that is necessary to fulfill this particular story. But and that's where the expert of the tech lead comes in, is the tech lead who is drawing out these workflows is able to identify each one of the stories that gets born from this and be able to decide, in order to fulfill that story, I'm going to need a person with that skill and a person with that skill and a person with that skill and a person with that skill. And you start to kind of go through and say, okay, who are the people that I need? I have at minimum, I can bring these 4 people on, but I also see these 2 people over here that say that they are trying to learn these skills. So let's go ahead and add them to the team. And now I've got my team of 6. And then we're all going to work on this one workflow. The amount of time it takes to go through this one workflow could vary from 1 week worth of work to maybe 2 weeks worth of work. And it doesn't really matter. The team should not be bound to the amount of time it takes to do this. It should not be bound. If it takes 2 weeks, it takes 2 weeks. If it takes 1 week, it takes 1 week. You work until the job is done, not until there's a deadline. That's the bottom line right there, right? And I think that this type of process that I'm talking about allows that to happen, because there's no management that's bombing you with due dates. You are working until the job is done, and you are forming your team according to the job at hand, which means you are going to work as fast as humanly possible. You and your team are going to be organized because you have the proper skill sets specifically required in order to fulfill this story. Everybody on your team should be able to fulfill at least one piece of this entire workflow. And that's how you comprise your team. If you are hyper-focused on keeping teams together and not disbanding them and reorganizing them, then you're going to have a lot of concern about the deadlines, because your teams are going to be comprised of people who may not know how to fulfill all of the story, which is okay at times. But that does mean that there's a lot more pressure on junior developers to fulfill those time obligations. And that's not exactly what teams want to have. So let's see. K. Ahmed says, also, after 25 years in the industry, I have come to this conclusion: to not complete the job, else they put you out of work and lay you off as soon as the project completes. Well, and I think this also addresses that too, because if the talent pool is constantly being churned, right? Then it means there's always the next job to do. It just may not be right now. But because the organization understands that there's this churn and there's this constant moving of personnel, there's no end of the project that suddenly we just drop everybody, because the next thing needs to be worked on. And you can scale if you do need to downsize your work pool. Then you unfortunately have to do that. I mean, businesses do contract they contract. I mean, like, get smaller, not as in signing contractors, but they start to scale down because the work isn't as necessary, right? Or the product has started to slim down, or the customers aren't paying as much. And this, again, I think will, because of the dynamic fluidity of the work base, I think once you start to see that pool of people that are the pool of people who are available is very large, then you can immediately identify, like, hey, 15 or 20% of our work, our work base is not even doing anything right now. That becomes an immediate metric and indicator that the business can kind of look at on a, quarterly basis and say, we've got to downsize. Like, we can't maintain this level of people in our skills. And so, then there's an evaluation that could possibly be done based upon, I hesitate to say that it would be done based upon how many workflows or how many times that you've been picked by a team lead. I don't really know what that particular metric would be. And that would be tough. It's always a tough decider when you decide to let people go. Like, that's a tough decision. But at least I think it gives the company a metric or a way of measuring that in some way, of knowing when they're top heavy, when they've got more people on staff not actually doing anything. And it's much more measurable, right? Like, how many of us have worked with that person that, like, doesn't do anything? And it's because they're not getting picked to really do any actual work. This actually exposes that, right? This really, really exposes those people. And I think maybe you could put some metrics around that of determining and finding out how much work are these individuals actually contributing. And you can contract your work pool a little bit that way. But that's a real touchy subject. And I'm by no means am I an expert on deciding when to downsize. I'm not there. I do know how this system that I'm proposing here helps HR determine when to, grow bigger. It's pretty obvious because, we only have so many people in our talent pool that are available, and we have some work that needs to be done that requires skills that we just simply don't have. So we need to go hire people with those skills and add them to the talent pool, and they get into the mix, and get churned within the work that needs to be done to get them intricately knowledgeable and educated on the products without having to have a huge on-ramp time, right? Because they can just be dropped right into the pool and off you go, right? You can go work as part of a team working on a particular workflow, and there you go, right? Okay, so Carlos, I think he tried to reformat his question here. He says, sorry for my English. Yes, I will try. Over time, they will not want to look for new members, but rather work for the same programmers who had more development in the project. Yeah, I think that is definitely something that could happen. And if that is how the tech leads want to pick their people, I understand that. But I think you could make it a practice of the tech leads to do something like pick one person from the talent pool you've never worked with before. If you made that a rule of the tech leads, that you had to pick one person from the talent pool that you've never worked with before, then I think until essentially you've worked with every single person, right? That would kind of force some of that out. So you could employ practices like that. I think that those are easily solved problems. I think that the teams, again, trying to remain self-organized, self-driven, have the developers much more closely aligned to the needs of the customer, and the skill sets being pulled according to the skill sets that are needed per stories. Having the teams constantly be churned over so that personnel is getting moved around for various different workflows. All of that I think is very, very helpful and beneficial because developers are not going to get burned out. They're going to constantly have something new to work on, and they have an education phase as part of this, right? We see that just before I have the inception part of that cycle, the education cycle exists, or the education phase exists, where I'm done with something, I've been disbanded, I'm no longer a part of a team. What do I want to do now? I want to upskill myself on what skill. What skill did I find out while I was working with that last team that I severely lacked in and I should educate myself on? Maybe I want to become the next tech lead and I want to work to do one of these workflows myself and manage a team like that. And so I'm going to take some of the education courses on how to be a tech lead. Those kind of things you could actually do in an organization like this, and it wouldn't require the enterprise business to have any sort of management other than just to schedule these things and figure out where they're going, who would they maybe partner up with in order to do those upskilling, which, hello, right here, I work for a great company that does exactly that. We are in the business of upskilling and educating instructors. And that company is called Galvanize. It's the enterprise division of Galvanize. You may have heard of us. Galvanize has a lot of other things like their Hack Reactor program. You guys have probably heard about Hack Reactor. It's one of the most popular boot camps that's out there. That's just one division of our business. I'm on the enterprise side. I train and upskill developers that are already out there in the workforce. K. Ahmed says, if you disband, you lose project knowledge. This disband should apply to business as the business is now digested and they are not needed. This disband should apply to business as the business is now digested and they are not needed. So I don't think you lose project knowledge. In fact, I think that you share it more. So just because they were disbanded, so you could assign a tech lead to a particular domain. So and this is a piece that I didn't cover, but I would think that you would assign a certain set of tech leads according to your clientele and the different domain experts that exist within your clientele, so that you have a tech lead that is continuously knowledgeable about the entire domain. And then they simply bring in fresh blood each time. And they could pick, when the tech lead is going and deciding who they're going to comprise the group of, they can pick from people who were previously worked with, right? You can still have that. You don't necessarily get rid of all of the domain knowledge. You have a tech lead or / architect who's continuously ongoing working with the domain experts. And you can that tech lead can bring in prior people that have worked on that domain before. But they should just be kind of supplemental, right? You don't necessarily want to comprise. I would not want to comprise the team repeatedly of the same individuals. I think you have to have some sort of churn going on there in bringing in fresh blood to work on a domain. Because the concern that I have is that one group of people, 5 or 6 people, are the only ones that know about a domain. That may not be as dangerous as an individual knowing about a domain, but it is fairly problematic, okay? And yes, I realize that a tech lead is that one person in this case that has that domain knowledge. But I think that if you have multiple people, if you have, say, let's say that a tech lead works through 3 workflows, which really is just 3 iterations, right? So I have a workflow. An iteration is comprised of a workflow, right? The tech lead goes and talks to the domain expert, extracts these different workflows, these use cases, right? And these use cases bring out a workflow. They work through 3 of these workflows with 3 separate teams. That means 3 different teams, 15 people or more, have knowledge of that domain at that point. That's not a bad thing. I think that works. And then any one of those people that are the 15 or so, at some point they might be elevated to tech lead and they themselves become a domain expert of the same thing that they've been working on. whatever that structure is, whatever that organization is, could be definitely different. The fear is that if I am not shown to be a productive person, or if I'm not seen as a necessity of this business, then they might let me go. But I think what this is doing is it's exposing people who are not really doing their jobs, because that's kind of one of the side effects of this process, is that tech leads are going to want less and less to work with people they recognize as not being effective developers. And so you don't get that those people who are not as effective developers end up not getting put on as many jobs, and that kind of starts to be reflected in the metrics. People don't want to work with that person anymore. And so, that person gets assigned fewer things. Now, that person could use their education downtime to build up the skills that are necessary. If it's a knowledge problem, I don't have enough skills or knowledge to be a part of many teams. Well, you're sitting there, and while you're just sitting there doing nothing, you might as well be educating yourself on the skills that you need in order to be more effective. So I think that it actually turns into a positive, that I'm worried about job security. Well, if I can take my downtime that the company is giving me to utilize some education resources to upskill and become more important to the company, that's a major benefit for the developers. And I don't have to worry about my job security being tied directly to a domain. What happens if that domain goes away? What happens if that client goes away? What happens if there's no more work needed on that project because it's been disbanded and there's a new project in its place being set up, and I am not a part of that? That all goes away. My job security being tied to my domain feels good. It feels like a great thing because, hey, as long as this domain exists, my job security is set because I'm the expert. Well, what happens when that domain disappears is your job disappears, and that's not good. But in this kind of system, once again, I think you have more inherent job security. If you are a good developer who is wanted, right? You're one of those people that gets stuff done and works well with the teams, and that's going to be borne out through this process, because tech leads are going to know who you are and want you to continue to work on their team. You're going to be fought over, right? And that would be a good thing. Here's another benefit that I need to add to the list here, now that I'm thinking about it, is because you have other developers that are kind of brand new working on the thing, means that the teams have to be focused on that being part of it. Like, you start to do some of the clean code things because you have to, right? If you are constantly churning, if you are constantly moving from one domain to another, you are going to be very frustrated if every time you come into a new part of the project, a new domain, the code that you encounter is terrible and it's not clean. So you have this constant review process of the code to refine it and spruce it up and refactor it. And it's different teams that are going to constantly be different people constantly coming in and refactoring and refining it, always. That's a huge major benefit, in my opinion, because when you have that kind of situation, you're constantly improving and updating the code to keep it fresh so it doesn't rot. Because I don't want that to be my experience next time. I don't want somebody else to have that experience. I don't want the next person to look at my code, go, blah, what was this person thinking? And not only that, if you're pair programming and you're mob programming, there's already kind of built into some of the way that you guys are behaving and working. The code that you guys are building in under that system is probably going to be a lot cleaner anyway. So the next team that comes in and looks at the code that the previous team wrote it's not going to be as frustrating. And you start to think in terms of that way. That starts to become a part of the culture, and the way that you think about the code that you're writing is, my God, I don't want to be one of those people that causes a problem for the next team, because I don't want to have problem code when I come to some other person's code. I want it to be clean and readable and understandable. So that's kind of a smaller, if you think through the process and go through, like, if we constantly have team churn, if we're constantly reorganizing these teams kind of ad hoc, those are some of the other side things that occur, some of the consequences that'll happen. It could definitely go south. I could see that. I could see, teams that are so hard pressed to get things out the door fast Because that's typically the real problem, is that teams don't have enough time to properly refactor their code to make it readable and understandable, or they don't implement the proper practices to make it readable. And so you could have kind of a spiral effect that every single time that another team comes on and looks at code, they're getting frustrated and it just continues to be worse. But I think that that amount of friction just inherently will cause teams to say, you know what, I got to fix this up. Well, we're here. This is such an atrocious piece of code. We need to fix it up, so that you constantly have this new, looking at new code, which is kind of, I think, what is a big appeal to a lot of developers, is to have something new in their faces every single day. That would be cool for a lot of developers. I don't want to necessarily look at the same exact code every single day. I might want to look at the same code for a week or two, but to have it be the same code base for 4 years that I work through, that would get really boring. It would cause burnout, right? But if you're having teams that are constantly changing every 1 or 2 weeks, and you're constantly working on something new, it may be, you may get called back to the same domain, but you're going to be working on another workflow that's part of that domain, and you kind of get moved around more frequently. I think you're going to have a lot less burnout. I think are you talking about in reference to having like one full product to be built, and then once the product is done being built, the team gets disbanded? And I'm taking that to a much shorter time period. Like I'm talking about 1 or 2 weeks, right? Like maybe I think 2 weeks is probably a good target for this, but I would, an iteration ideally is about a week, but that's still with so the 1 week iterations is kind of a feedback thing for teams that are focused on one single domain. And that, I think, is not as important once you structure the teams according to this. I think a iteration can be dynamic. It can be 1 week, it can be 2 weeks. I would hate to have it be more than 3 weeks. But I think that what you're doing is you're structuring the amount of work according to the workflow the client requires, and you're going to have your team get it done as fast as possible. Like this structure that I'm talking about gets the team to delivery faster than anything. So yeah, I think that keeping teams together for a long period of time is causes burnout, frequent burnout. It causes less knowledge transfer. And I think that there's just a lot of benefits that this system that I'm kind of introducing here would provide. I think the disbanding thing, I think it's just underrated. I have had some pushback on like the Reddit thread that I started on this about the domain knowledge and teams work better if the longer they stay together. I understand that, but I also think that it should not in and of itself be the reason you keep teams together. I think you have to become, if you want to be a successful developer, you have to know how to work within different teams. If you want to get better at your craft, you have to learn how to work with other people, doing other skills and having other skills. If you just have the exact same team working on things, you become a stagnant team. Your team is not going anywhere. You may feel comfortable. You may get a lot of work done on your domain, but the problem is that your team and your skills become stagnant that way. And even if you allow a team to do a bunch of crossover through pair programming and mob programming where I'm a back-end developer, but I'm learning the UX side of things, like that can only be sustained for so long before I really understand this domain from top to bottom. It took me 6 months to do that because of all the work that I've been doing up and down the entire domain infrastructure. But now I'm kind of like, I have nowhere else to go because my domain knowledge is complete. I have nothing more to learn about. All I have to do is just implement. That's the only thing that I have left in my life to do as a developer is to implement. I don't have any new knowledge or new skills or new training or new anything unless I seek it out myself, unless I force myself to go out and go learn. But what I'm doing in this system, like I have that as a stage. It is a part of the cycle that I am proposing, is that you incept, you organize, you refine, you build, you have a retro, you disband the group, and then once the group is disbanded, all the individuals go into a work pool, and while you're in that work pool, you have the option to go educate yourself. The business, the company, the teams, the developers themselves this can be totally self-organized. This education phase, it's gonna be totally self-organized. We've got a conference room. We're gonna have anybody who wants to come and attend my talk, it can come and attend, right? That's what you can do during the education phase. Is you can constantly have these type of workshops. You can do workshops. You can do talks. You can have a conference, right? You can host a conference. You can do all sorts of different things during that education phase. And it's built into the process as opposed to, oh, I've got all these features I have to implement this iteration. I'm not going to have any time to do any sort of education stuff. When am I going to upskill? When I go home? I'm thinking this is going to be the last question here. So Kay Ahmed says, exactly. I seek out the knowledge best for my career and replace the decision makers. So I make decisions for my career and future, not someone's for their business. Yeah, not for future, not someone in business. Yeah, exactly. I want more control over my upskilling, my knowledge that I need to accumulate, right? You think I should take disband out, huh? Just leave it kind of as a natural thing? No, I think that's key to the whole thing. I think the disbanding and reforming is a major key to the whole thing, because the tech leads or architects that are working with the domain owners, right? The domain experts, they are going to then need to organize a team around the skills to accomplish that particular workflow. And those need to be dynamically assigned. I need to be able to pick from a talent pool based upon the needs that my client has. And I need to be able to do that on demand. And if we are keeping teams formed together indefinitely, you are not allowing for the work to be, I hesitate to say assigned, but essentially you're not allowing the correct skills to be brought into the specific problem. You are forcing certain teams to address challenges they may not be equipped for. And then you create all sorts of friction there. I'd like to thank the following members for being a part of this community. Without your support, this channel would not be possible. Thank you.